Chapter 2. February 15, 1863. The child is running, bare feet on the cold stone floor, his lungs straining for air, throat dry and raw. No matter how fast he runs, he doesn't seem to get any further. Then footfalls become splashes, as water trickles across the stones. Soon it is pulling at his ankles, dragging him down, tugging at his torso. He is gasping for breath, but none comes, just liquid swirling into his mouth and gushing down his throat. He gags and chokes, screaming. He has to escape, he has to get out. The murky, silt-laden waters start to shimmer as a great light moves nearer. It illuminates the depths, and the boy forgets he needed to breathe, forgets he wants to escape. If he can just reach the light, everything will be better. Nyssa sat up with a start. What had that been? A dream or a nightmare? Already the details were fading away, driven from her conscious mind by the sunlight piercing the curtains, illuminating thousands of dust particles floating above her bed. Nyssa closed her eyes and let herself lie back down, trying to hold on to the fast-receding fragments of what she had experienced. She was dreaming about drowning. She knew that for certain. It had been a dream, but not her own. She had been a spectator, a voyeur. Already the cold waters were closing in around her. Nyssa shivered once and was asleep. Baroness von Luckner entered the breakfast room to find the doctor savouring a pair of kippers. He rose from his seat and welcomed her to the table before resuming his appraisal of the smoked herring. "You know, I have sampled delicacies from many different worlds, but there is little to match the simple delights of a kipper," he enthused. The Baroness remained unsure of what to make of this interloper, who had appeared so mysteriously last night and wormed his way into the Queen's affections with such alacrity. She decided to humour him and see what more could be discovered. "Is that correct?" "Oh, I should think so. Can you think of anything finer?" the doctor replied, holding a fork full of fish aloft. "Dinner in a diner, perhaps?" "I'm not sure I understand you, Doctor." "Do you have diners yet?" "Probably not. I suppose the closest British equivalent would be a coaching house, or a roadside cafe in future. Still, I fancy none of them could offer such a succulent morsel before midday." He popped the forkful into his mouth and chewed on the fish with undisguised ardour. "Your arrival last night was quite unexpected," Luckner ventured. "I do like to surprise people," he said. "You might not find them at their best, but they will be more honest that way. No time to hide their guilty secrets, as it were. Her Majesty said your family name was Luckner." "That's correct." The Baroness sipped at the cup of tea that had appeared before her, spirited into place by one of the household staff lining the walls like ghosts. "That's very interesting. I knew a Felix von Luckner once, commanded a German vessel during the Great War." "The Great War?" "Most remarkable chap. Captured off the coast of Fiji and taken prisoner along with all his men. They were interred in New Zealand. Do you know it?" The Baroness shook her head, while doing her best to encourage the doctor. "Anyway, dear old Felix kept escaping, making off in stolen fishing boats and building rafts out of sheds. Eventually, I think they let him go to prevent him trying their patience any further." "Really? What a fascinating anecdote, Doctor." "You think so?" "Felix would no doubt have delivered it with more panache, but I'm not sure he's been born yet. It's just, with you having the same name and him having been a baron, I thought you might be related. Perhaps you're his grandmother." "No, I do not have any children. That is why I became a guardian to James." "Quite right. Every boy needs a guardian angel, someone with their best interests at heart, especially one with such rare gifts as James possesses." "I couldn't agree more." "Of course, not all are so fortunate in life. Some fall into the clutches of disreputable people. From where was it you rescued James?" The Baroness stood up sharply. It was clear the doctor was not the buffoon she had first thought, and his idle ramblings were a ruse designed to catch her off guard. "If you'll excuse me, I must see how my ward is feeling this morning. He finds a séance quite draining. Good morning to you." Luckner excused herself from the table. "I'm sure he does. Perhaps I will visit with him later." Once she had gone, the doctor turned to the servants standing behind him, smiling broadly. "Now, I wonder if there's any chance of having another pair of these delightful kippers." Nyssa opened her eyes again. Strange how sometimes sleep played tricks on the unconscious mind. Her mind was telling her she had just laid back down for a moment, trying to rediscover that window on the dream of another. But now, as she looked around the room, Nyssa knew several hours had elapsed. The sunlight had moved across the room, and she could hear people passing in the corridor outside. I should make a note of this, she decided, but could not see the journal in which she had been recording her observations. Perhaps the doctor had it. The doctor. That unlocked a flood of memories, and she knew where she was. Judging by the surroundings, they had become guests of Queen Victoria. This chamber was much larger and grander than her bedroom in the TARDIS, Nyssa observed. It was far more ornate, with elaborate plasterwork across the ceiling and a rich tapestry hung above a fireplace on the wall opposite her bed. Nearby was a 3-panelled screen, each section lovingly embroidered with silk threads to resemble the feathers of a peacock. In one corner stood a magnificent walnut wardrobe, accompanied by a matching dresser with mirror. A white bowl stood on the dresser, steam rising from the warm water inside it. Nyssa found she was clad in a white linen nightdress, its sleeves reaching down to her wrists and the bodice buttoned up tightly to her neck. Another memory floated to the surface of her thoughts, an all-pervading smell that clung to the air as though infecting her thoughts, trying to inhabit her reason. Last night's faint had been an involuntary defense mechanism, she decided. Recently, she had experienced a heightened telepathy while in the presence of highly developed alien beings. Was her dreaming visitation an after-effect of that telepathy? Could her exposure to the Xeraphin have awakened some psychic sensitivity long since dormant in the people of Traken? It was an interesting theory, but one that would have to wait. Nyssa realized she was quite ravenous, and the bold sunlight indicated the morning was passing her by. It was time to get out of bed. Sweeping aside the covers, Nyssa walked to the dresser. Aside from a bump on her head, she seemed to be suffering no ill effects from her fainting spell. A cloth was ready by the bowl of steaming water, with several pristine towels nearby. She shed the white gown and began methodically washing herself, the warm liquid reinvigorating her skin. A door opened behind her, and Nyssa heard a gasp of astonishment. A maid had entered and was trying not to stare at the naked woman. "Hello, I'm Nyssa. What's your name?" "Mary, miss. I'm terribly sorry. I didn't know you were awake." Nyssa wrapped a towel round herself, smiling at the maid's embarrassment. "There's no need to apologize. I was just taking advantage of this lovely water. Did you put it here?" "Yes, miss. I could run you a bath if you'd prefer." "No, the water was fine, Mary. I'm quite hungry, but I need to dress before I can make an appearance. Do you know where my clothes went?" Mary retrieved Nyssa's gown from the wardrobe and various undergarments from the drawers of the dresser. "They've all been cleaned and pressed, miss. I made a few repairs to the dress too. I hope that suits you." "That sounds fine. It was a little big for me anyway. Could you help me put it on? On Traken we don't wear such formal clothes." "Of course, miss. Traken? Is that on the subcontinent? Nissa was about to correct the young woman, but remembered the doctor's urgings. In some cases, total honesty was not always necessary to achieve one's ends. Not exactly. It's in another part of the Empire, she replied. Getting dressed proved to be a lengthy process, with Mary insisting Nissa wear several more undergarments than before. Most cumbersome of these was a metal cage fastened around her waist, apparently called a crinoline. This was covered with several petticoats, so that Nissa's gown billowed out to twice the width of her hips. The maid seemed to take delight in all the flounces and fabrics, admitting that she had once wanted to become a seamstress. But the death of her father had forced his daughters to go into service. Mary did not seem to mourn his passing, confiding he had been a bitter, violent man. Finally, Nissa was ready to venture out into the rest of the castle. "Where do you think I would find the doctor?" she asked. "Do you need a physician, miss?" Mary replied. "No, my travelling companion, the doctor. I arrived with him last night," Nissa explained. The maid smiled despite herself. "Oh, him! That gentleman's been all over the castle, miss. If you stand still long enough, he'll probably find you." Nissa nodded. That certainly sounded like the doctor. "In that case, I think some lunch would be best. Can you show me the way?" "No, miss. My duties restrict me to the bedchambers. If you ask one of the other household servants, they will be happy to escort you." It was noon when Lieutenant Ash finally gave the order for the soldiers to break camp and move upstream. Sergeant Volmer had been politely urging his commanding officer to set off sooner, but Ash refused to be rushed. Any suspicions Volmer had about the lieutenant's fragile physical state remained unspoken. Ash had spent several hours in the company of the Walker brothers, who owned and operated the new Lanark cotton mills. When the lieutenant had staggered back to where the troops were settled, his steps were unsteady, and his speech slurred. Volmer had helped his commanding officer into bed, rather than have the lower ranks see Ash in such a state. The contingent was slowly making its way upstream, the sound of rushing water growing steadily until it was a roar ahead of them. Eventually, the greenery parted to reveal the source of the cacophony. Ahead stood a mighty stone dam over which fell a steady torrent, the water crashing down the height of 3 houses to rocks below. Spray bounced up into the air, creating an ever-present rainbow. Volmer called a halt to their progress, giving him a chance to consult with the lieutenant. "Is this what we came to guard?" Ash shook his head. "No, our orders take us further upriver to Coralin." He pointed at the dam. "Magnificent, isn't it, Sergeant?" "Yes, sir. But what's it for?" Ash began to mop his brow with a white cotton handkerchief. Despite the spray created by the dam's overflow, the air was close and humid. "2 gentlemen hatched a scheme to create power by damming the river. The Walker brothers explained it to me last night. Something involving turbines and steam. Dashed complicated and clever, if you ask me. All very scientific. Anyway, they built the dam and flooded the valley upstream, right back to Coralin, but ran out of money before they could install the equipment to harness this power. Dissolved their partnership and went their separate ways. One of them claimed the project had been cursed and threw himself off the dam. Nasty business all round." Nearby, the men were getting restive. It was time to move on. "Nights fall quite quickly this far north in February, and we need daylight to make camp again." "Well, then you should have made certain we set forth a little sooner, shouldn't you, Volmer?" "Yes, sir, certainly, sir. Very sound advice. Now, if you'll give the order." Within a few minutes, the contingent was resuming its journey, now having to climb around the northern edge of the dam to reach higher ground. After satisfying her hunger, Nissa found the doctor consulting a heavy, cloth-bound volume in the castle's extensive library. There you are. Fully recovered, I hope? He asked, peering over the top of his spectacles at her. Much better, Nyssa replied. What are you doing? Finding out a little more about Baroness von Luckner. I'm not convinced her credentials are all they could be. Aha! The doctor read to himself. When Nyssa tried to get his attention, he held up a hand to silence her. Nearly done? Yes, I thought so. There is no Baroness von Luckner. He snapped the book shut and replaced it on a shelf, folding the spectacles away into a pocket of his frock coat. So, she seems to be an impostor. But her ward's abilities are genuine, Nyssa replied. I could have sworn he was speaking in Adric's voice last night. It was most uncanny. I wonder how. Telepathy, or a form of mental projection, perhaps. We simply thought we heard the voice of Adric. But it seemed more convincing than that. Yes, I feel certain James is involved with that disturbance the TARDIS detected in the space-time continuum. But the question is, how? We need to find out more about this young man. The doctor related the Queen's tale of what had taken place at the séance before gently placing a hand on Nyssa's right shoulder. Do you feel strong enough to face James again? There's no guarantee he won't produce another manifestation. I'm ready. Part of it was the surprise. Earth in the 19th century is the last place I expected to be haunted by Adric, Nyssa said. What will you be doing? The doctor smiled. I think it's time to confront the so-called Baroness. She may be an impostor, but somehow she latched on to a very powerful psychic entity in James. I want to know where she found him. Discovering that may answer a lot of my other questions. Just before he left, the doctor retrieved a slim notebook from a pocket in his coat and handed it to Nyssa. I found this on the floor of the mausoleum after you collapsed last night. I don't think we want such a journal falling into the wrong hands, do we? Nyssa accepted his gentle admonishment and went on her way. Sir Henry Ponsonby stood before the Queen in her private office. Your Majesty, I could find no evidence to support this woman's claim to any title. As far as I can ascertain, she does not even bear the name Luckner. A telegram from that noble family in Austria has denied all knowledge of such a relative, by birth or by marriage. She seems to have first appeared several years ago travelling under this name. Not long after that, she began to visit the royal courts of Europe, accompanied by the young man. The Queen made little effort to hide her unhappiness. You are saying this woman is an impostor? Yes, ma'am. Yet she has been organising séances, raising the hopes of the recently bereaved. A most regrettable situation, ma'am. What about the boy? What do we know of him? His performance at the séance removed even our doubts. Surely he cannot also be a fraud. Of that we are not certain. Obviously, this young man cannot be held responsible for the conduct of his guardian, but their mere association calls into question all that he has said thus far, the private secretary ventured. The Queen rose from the desk and began to pace the room, two ladies-in-waiting shadowing her movements. This is simply unacceptable, she announced. We will not be taken for a fool. If this woman be proved false, she shall be punished for it. We have never taken her word as having any value. But the young man... The Queen stopped abruptly. Have we received any word from the contingent sent into Scotland to investigate his claims? Not yet, ma'am. The last communication indicated the soldiers should reach their destination later today. The necessary equipment has also been dispatched, as per your instructions, and should reach them within a day or two. Sir Henry hesitated before continuing further. If I might be so bold, Your Majesty, General Dalton is less than happy at your intervention in this matter. The General's unhappiness is not our concern. Where is this so-called Baroness? I believe she is resting in her quarters, ma'am. Good. We have long wanted to visit that part of the castle. Have the General meet us there. Nissa was returning to her room with the journal when she saw James standing outside on a balcony in the rain. As she approached, Nissa could see a thin stream of blood trickling from his nostrils. She tapped on a glass panel in the balcony doors. James spun round, hurriedly wiping the blood from his face. "Are you all right?" Nissa asked. James opened the doors and stepped inside. His clothes were soaked through, and he was shivering. Nissa took him by the hand and led him to her bedchamber. "What were you doing out there? You'll catch your death of cold standing in the rain like that." I can't explain it," James stuttered through chattering teeth. "Sometimes I just don't feel I belong here." "At Windsor Castle?" Nissa asked, tugging on the bell pull in her room to summon Mary. "Or do you mean that you feel out of place everywhere?" "Yes, that's it," he replied, his eyes coming alive. "I feel that I'd rather die than stay here any more. I have to get back." Mary appeared, and seemed surprised to find Nissa entertaining a gentleman in her room. She was even more surprised by Nissa's request. "But he should be having a bath in his own chambers, miss, if you don't mind my saying so. It isn't proper that he—" "I don't care about what's proper, Mary. This young man needs our help, and we are going to give it. Now, please, prepare a hot bath for him and fetch some dry clothes for when he is finished." "If you say so, miss," the maid agreed reluctantly. "If it will make you any happier, he can undress and bathe behind that screen. That way some decorum is maintained." "That would be for the best, miss." "And not a word of this to anyone else. Is that clear?" Mary just bobbed in a curtsy and went to fetch the hot water. Nissa went back to James, who was still shivering near a window. "You were saying you have to get back, James. To where are you trying to return?" "The spirit world. I went there once when I was just a boy. It was wondrous, a place of great joy and happiness. I met all those from my family who had died and passed over to the other side. I never wanted to come back." His words broke down. "What was it like, this spirit world?" "It's impossible to describe. I haven't got the words. Not as would do it justice." "Please try." James nodded. "Imagine a place more beautiful than you've ever seen. A home you never knew you had. That's what it was like being home, only better. You felt like you belonged. It was, well, heavenly. But you didn't play the harp or float on clouds or anything of those things preachers talk about. I felt loved and wanted, like I'd never known before." He fell silent again, his face enraptured by the recollections. "What happened?" "I was pulled back to this world. My brothers thought they were rescuing me. They thought I was drowning. Somehow they pulled me back to this life. When they did, I could still hear the voices in my head, the voices of all those from the spirit world. When I met someone new, I found myself speaking with the voices of their dead." "Some would consider that a blessing," Nissa suggested. "It's cursed my life. Ever since that day I've been punished for what I can do. My mother and the local doctor had me committed to an asylum in Glasgow." James pulled back his thick, damp hair to reveal a patch of scalp on one side where no hair grew. Livid scar tissue jagged across the skin. "If the spirit world was like heaven, I know where hell is, and its name is the Lock." Baroness von Luckner was not surprised when the doctor appeared at her door. She might not possess the remarkable abilities of her ward, but she could sense when trouble was coming. At breakfast, this mysterious stranger had given her warning of his suspicions. No doubt he had since uncovered at least part of the truth, making a second counter inevitable. She was just irritated that it had come so soon, before she could make good her departure from the royal residence. Packing away her gowns and belongings had taken longer than she expected without assistance from one of the servants. "Leaving so soon?" the doctor said. He pulled open the lid of the trunk to reveal the clothes inside, along with 2 solid silver picture frames and several other carefully chosen and quite expensive items. "And I see you were taking some souvenirs with you. Presents from a grateful queen, perhaps?" "Yes, you can go and ask her herself if you like," Luckner suggested. "That will not be necessary," an imperious voice replied. The queen was standing in the doorway, glaring at the two of them. "We are already here." "Your Majesty," the doctor began, bowing deeply, "I believe this woman is an impostor. She is certainly no baroness, and as for being a Luckner," he gestured at the stolen items sitting atop the truck's contents, "that is a noble family name, and not one usually associated with petty theft." "Thank you, Doctor. We are already aware of this woman's duplicity," Victoria said, sweeping into the room followed by her ladies-in-waiting and General Dalton. "Perhaps she would like to tell us her real name and the purpose behind this falsehood." The impostor sagged into a chair, her head bowed, the fight gone from her limbs. "Walker, Mrs. Sylvia Walker," she admitted, her cultured tones and Germanic accent replaced by those of a Londoner born and bred. "Did we give you permission to sit in our presence?" Victoria asked haughtily. Mrs. Walker stood up again, not daring to lift her gaze from the floor. "Sorry, Your Majesty, I didn't... Sorry." "Your apologies are neither here nor there, woman. We want the truth." The Queen summoned Dalton to her side. "If you are unwilling to divulge it, we will happily pass you over to others. You may be assured that they will not stint in their efforts to find the truth." The doctor stepped into the fray, bowing his head to the Queen. "Your Majesty, I do not believe such tactics will be necessary. Before you arrived, I was about to question this woman about her deception. Would you let me continue?" Victoria nodded her acquiescence. She raised an eyebrow at the General, who quickly fetched her a chair. Once seated, the Queen signalled for the doctor to resume his questions. "When I arrived, you were preparing to leave. Why?" he asked Mrs. Walker. "The jig was up and I knew it. Decided it were time to get out while I still could." "How long have you been maintaining this facade?" "This what?" "How long have you been pretending to be Baroness von Luckner?" 3 years now. You see, I'm an actress. At least I used to be. Did well on the London stage, too. But I was getting old for that. I read about this woman who'd pretended to be part of a noble family. She had been caught out, but I knew I could carry it off, being an actress and all. So, instead of Mrs. Sylvia Walker, I became the Baroness. It's amazing what you can get away with if you're all high and mighty, playing at being Lady Muck. Mrs. Walker paled as she remembered in whose presence she was standing. "Sorry, Your Majesty." The Queen waved away her concern, and the impostor continued. "I started doing the rounds of all the nobility, blending in and learning how to play the toff. Nobody ever questions you when you got a title. They wouldn't dare. Soon, I could walk into any salon or garden party and pretend to be Baroness von Luckner, treating the servants like dirt and taking everything I could carry. The rich don't need to steal, so I was never suspected." The doctor nodded. "When did you first encounter your ward?" Mrs. Walker shivered, fear suddenly making her cold. 2 years ago in Scotland. I was visiting stately homes north of the border. One host, near Glasgow, suggested a tour of an asylum for the insane, a pleasant day out for taking pity on those less fortunate than ourselves. That's where I first saw him." Extract from Observations and Analysis, a journal. I pressed James for more details about his past while he took a hot bath, concealed behind the screen in my room. He said the lock was a hospital for women with sexually transmitted diseases. But the cures were worse than the diseases. The doctors gave the woman mercury to swallow as a treatment. I protested that would be far worse than whatever ailment it was meant to cure, and probably cause death in many of the patients. The women who died that way were the lucky ones, James replied. Others were suspended over heated baths of mercury so the vapours would burn out the infection. That wasn't all it burnt out. I could hear them screaming from my cell when the treatments were taking place. I was aghast at such barbarism. Anyone administering such treatments was a monster, not a physician. I demanded James tell me who conceived such horrors. Doctors, all good men and true. When the women went mad, they were moved to the asylum. It was my job to tend them. They lost their noses and their teeth. The flesh was rotting from their bodies. The smell, it clung to the walls like a shroud. His voice tailed off, unable to cope with the memories any longer. Every evening the ghosts of all those who died in the lock used to gather round me in the dark. I had to keep a candle lit through the night to stop them appearing. The burn on my scalp, that was from the hot mercury. 3 times I tried to escape, but they always caught me. Once I got all the way back to the village where I grew up. I was determined to find the gateway to the spirit world again, or die trying. It couldn't be worse than the lock. Years had passed since I was sent away. In the meantime, the valley below Coralline had been flooded. I almost drowned trying to swim down to the portal, but it was too deep for me. Someone found my body and sent me back to the asylum. Every time the doctor in charge came near me, I started speaking in the voices of the women he had tortured and killed with his cure. To shut me up, he held my face over the bubbling liquid. One of the bubbles burst, and the mercury splashed against my head, burning into my scalp. I found myself unable to speak. Such was the horror of James's recollections. What he had been through! It was astounding he was still sane. Eventually, I asked how he finally got free of the lock. "It was hellish in that place, let me tell you," Mrs. Walker recalled. "Gave me nightmares for weeks afterwards. What they were doing to those poor women, it weren't right. The doctors, they kept children there too. They boasted about using the children to cure visiting male patients who had been infected, how virgins could remove the disease. One of the boys was James. He must have been 13 or so at the time. I couldn't see why he was being kept there. Then he shook my hand." The doctor had been listening to her story carefully, and began speaking with the voice of someone who had died. Mrs. Walker nodded vigorously. "My husband Bill, he passed over years ago, knocked down by a runaway carriage. Him dying was the reason I went back on the stage. Only decent way I knew to support myself. This boy, he starts talking to me with Bill's voice, saying as how he was in a happier place and all. I thought it must be a trick, but James did the same thing to the next person he meets, calling up the spirit of their dead niece." "So, you adopted the boy as your ward, planning to use him as a distraction. You robbed the bereaved, while James talked in the voices of their dearly departed." Mrs. Walker nodded, shamefaced. The Queen stood up. "We have heard enough. This woman deserves the sternest of punishments for these crimes." Dalton nodded. "And her accomplice?" Victoria wavered, apparently unsure of what to do. She turned to the doctor. "What do you suggest?" "I would not be so quick to judge," he replied. "Mrs. Walker may be all the things said of her here, but I believe there is more to James than meets the eye. If your Majesty would permit me, I should like to study him, to ascertain whether or not he possesses the abilities claimed for him." Victoria nodded. "It is agreed. Doctor, you have a day to make your assessment and report back to us. The young man will be your responsibility during that time. General, have this impostor removed from the residence. Mrs. Walker, we strongly suggest you maintain a healthy silence about the events you have witnessed here in the past few days. Is that understood?" The impostor just nodded. "Good. If you keep that silence, we will look favourably upon granting you clemency. If you tell others what has happened here, we shall ensure you spend the rest of your days behind bars." The Queen swept from the room, the audience at an end. Extract from Observations and Analysis, a journal. I listened carefully as James recalled travelling around Europe with the Baroness, performing like a circus act for the crowned heads of different nations. When he emerged, fully dressed, from behind the screen, I asked him a question that had been nagging at me. "Last night, when you began speaking with Adric's voice, how did it feel?" "You want to know if that was real, don't you? That's what everybody wants to know. Am I truly creating a channel between them and the dead? The worst part is I don't know. Perhaps I'm just telling you what you want to know, what you need to hear, giving you some comfort. But it feels more than that to me. It seems real." His face was warm and alive again. "What do you believe?" I admitted to the ulterior motive for my question, saying I had lost someone else who was close to me. I was careful not to say too much, so James had a chance to prove the truth behind his words. His face fell at my request. "Nissa, you don't know what you're asking. Every time I reach out to the spirit world, a fragment of me dies, like someone is forcing splinters of glass into my brain." "The nosebleeds?" "I never used to suffer them. Now it's after every episode, every séance. My head begins pounding, and I feel a great blackness rushing towards me. It's terrifying." I pointed out the contradiction of such fears. If James believed he had visited the spirit world, why should he fear death? Did he not already know what lay beyond this life? "Every living thing fears death," James explained. "It's a natural reaction to facing your own mortality. Even though I believe in the spirit world, the thought of dying still terrifies me. What if I don't make it to heaven? What if the Creator of us all cannot forgive me for the things I have done?" "Such as aiding and abetting a thief called Mrs. Sylvia Walker?" the doctor interjected, striding into the bed's chamber. "The Baroness has been unmasked as an impostor and is being taken away. But you already knew that, didn't you?" James nodded. I could sense her distress. "I don't doubt for a minute," the doctor said. "You have several remarkable talents, an empathic ability to read people's emotions, perhaps even their minds. Mimicry of voices you have never heard, that is quite rare, but speaking with the dead—" "You don't believe I can do that?" James asked. I turned to the doctor, eager to hear his thoughts about what we had witnessed so far. "I'm not sure," he said. "The Queen has given me a day to decide whether or not you can be trusted. So let's start at the beginning. Tell me when and how you first discovered these talents of yours." It was dusk when the soldiers finished establishing their encampment near Coralin. Volmer insisted on posting guards to keep watch through the night. "Surely that isn't necessary, is it?" the lieutenant had asked. "It took us most of a day to travel 2 miles upstream to reach this point. I don't think it likely we'll be facing any resistance from the natives." Ash laughed at his own joke, despite the glowering face of his sergeant. "Posting guards is standard procedure in such circumstances," Volmer replied. "We are in unknown territory with an uncertain mission and no way of knowing what, if any, threats we might be facing. Basic precautions are designed to protect us from such unknowns, sir." "Well, if you insist, Sergeant," Ash eventually agreed. "If any of these unknown threats wants me, I shall be snoring gently in my tent. A good night to you." "And to you, sir." Volmer selected 3 pairs of men for sentry duty, each to stand guard for 3 hours. "Keep your eyes and ears open and your mouths shut. We don't know what we're dealing with here, so stay alert. Johnson and Hawthorne, you take first watch. If anything untoward happens, fetch me first, and the lieutenant's second. Got that? Extract from Observations and Analysis, a journal. The doctor waited until dark before going back to the TARDIS to fetch equipment. I watched for his return from my bedchamber, Mary keeping me company. The maid had insisted on staying, as James had fallen asleep on my bed. "You must have a chaperone, miss. If one of the senior staff were to walk in and find the two of you unaccompanied in here, think of the damage to your reputation." The moral strictures of this era seemed quaint and prosaic, but that is how these people live, and so it should be respected. My father had often spoken of the need to recognize the value of the beliefs and opinions of others. You could never understand the reasons why somebody acted as they did until you could see any situation from their point of view, as well as your own. Mary was the first to see the doctor returning, a heavy box clutched under his right arm. A few minutes later, he had found his way back to my bedchamber. He began sorting through the equipment inside his box. "Mary, could you wake James, please? And Nissa, perhaps you could help me get all this ready." I studied the items the doctor had brought back from the TARDIS, a haphazard mixture of life sign monitors, electrographic pulse counter, and energy monitoring systems. Finding no rhyme or reason to this assortment, I asked his intentions. "I'm going to hypnotize James and regress him to the moment when he believes he went to the other side. We'll be able to monitor the event to see how it impacts on the space-time continuum." Mary was uneasy at becoming part of this plan, expressing her fears at being confronted by the ghost of her late father. She volunteered to stand outside in the corridor and alert us if anyone was approaching. The doctor smiled reassuringly at her. "That's fine, Mary. There's no guarantee we will succeed, or even that James will summon forth any dead spirits, but I wouldn't dream of forcing you to witness something like this." Mary admitted there was a page called Michael stationed at the end of the corridor who was smitten with her. "I will talk to him for a while and keep watch for you." When she was gone, the doctor turned to James. "What I said to Mary applies just as much to you. I have no wish to force you into this. For the hypnotic regression to succeed, you must be a willing participant. There is a risk involved. If your spirit is drawn to this world you describe, there is no guarantee I will be able to bring it back." I asked what effect that would have, to which the doctor said he wasn't sure. If the link was broken, James's body would remain here while his spirit was left to wander between worlds. He might become one of the ghosts that apparently possess him. James agreed to take part. "I need answers." The doctor began setting up his equipment. He asked me to monitor the results. "Once we begin, I cannot let my concentration lapse for a moment. If it does, both James and I could suffer the same fate." Private Eric Hawthorne had joined the army from no great desire to serve his queen or country, and certainly without any plans to sacrifice his life for anyone else. He simply wanted to escape prison for petty theft, and a dozen other offences. The presiding magistrate at his trial had offered him a stark choice: 2 years hard labour or service with the armed forces. "Hard work and discipline, that's what the likes of you need. It'll make a man out of you." With those words still ringing in his ears, Hawthorne had signed up for a 7-year stretch in an infantry unit. The pay was decent enough, and there seemed little danger of having to dodge a bullet or bayonet while stationed at Aldershot. Best of all, Hawthorne soon found his light-fingered ways and eye for an opportunity, legal or otherwise, made him a valuable asset to his brothers-in-arms. If anyone needed anything, Hawthorne could procure it. For a price, of course. This lucrative sideline was providing an ample secondary income for the sly-faced private. He had tried to trade his way off this expedition north of the border, but bloody Sergeant Vollmer had been having none of it. "God preserve us from virtuous men," Hawthorne thought grumpily as he tapped out the contents of his pipe and ground the embers under his foot. It was close to the end of his stint on guard, and the sooner he could get his head down for a few hours' sleep, the happier Hawthorne would be. Sharing the post with Johnson had not made the sentry duty pass any faster. Nicholas had only joined up a few weeks before, and was twitchier than a rat in a cheesemonger's shop. He jumped at every sound, hissing, "Who goes there?" at the surrounding trees. In a forest filled with badgers, birds, and other animals, nocturnal noises were only to be expected. But Johnson reacted to each and every one. Hawthorne had contemplated knocking his partner unconscious just to get some peace. The moon was directly overhead, and Hawthorne decided enough was enough. It was time to wake up the next pair of sentries and get some sleep himself. The sound of a branch cracking underfoot nearby sent Johnson into another spasm of nervous readiness. "Who goes there?" he hissed for the 19th time. "Nobody bloody goes there," Hawthorne snarled, unable to contain his frustration anymore. "It'll be a fox or a deer wandering about. Now let's pack it in for the night." Johnson shook his head. "No, Thorny, I saw something." "For the love of Christ, you've said that a dozen times already," the older soldier snarled. "There's nothing out there." "There it is again." Johnson was pointing now, his finger and hand shaking, terror clearly visible in his face. Hawthorne rolled his eyes and turned to look where the 19-year-old was pointing. There was something in the distance. A human figure was walking through the trees down towards the water. "Who the bloody hell is that?" Hawthorne whispered. Extract from Observations and Analysis, a journal. The doctor put James into a trance with remarkable ease. I monitored their progress via the equipment the doctor had retrieved from the TARDIS. James's life signs were relaxed, his breathing calm and measured, his brain waves like those of most humans at rest. The doctor began leading James back through his experiences, travelling with Mrs. Walker, his attempt to get back to the other side, his years at the lock. After 20 minutes of careful work, the doctor had regressed James to the day where he first began to experience links with the spirit world. "You are swimming in the river when you see a light. What happens next?" A shadow crossed James's face as he answered, "I think it might be a coin on the bottom of the river. I dive down towards the glint. I want to get it before John or Josiah see it. John will only take it from me and spend it, but I want it for my own." "But it isn't a coin, is it?" "No. The closer I get, the more I can see. It's a light, like glimpsing the sun through a gap in black clouds. But the further down I swim, the greater the pressure is getting on my ears and eyes. I feel like my lungs are going to burst, but I keep going." "What happens as you reach the light?" "I stretch my hand forwards to it, my fingertips straining to touch it. I expect the light to be cold, but instead it's warm, washing over my fingers, across my hand, and now it's moving up my arm. I realize the light isn't moving. I'm falling into it. I panic, but can't stop myself. Just white light all around me." The young man fell silent, his features warmed by candles illuminating the bedchamber. "Where are you now, James?" the doctor asked gently. "I'm walking across a bridge. I look back and see the river behind me, but I don't want to go back there any more. Ahead, I see someone approaching. It's my grandfather. He smiles and I run towards him. He hugs me, just like he used to do. I tell my grandfather he is dead, but he just laughs. I don't have to worry about things like that anymore. I'm on the other side. I look down and realize the bridge has disappeared." "What can you see, James?" "Everything is so beautiful, so peaceful and quiet. I meet my sisters, the babies my mother had Dr. Kirkhope get rid of before they were born. They say I'm going to like it on the other side. They want to give me a present. But something is wrong, very wrong." Hawthorne found himself running down the steep slope after Johnson, trying to keep pace with the younger man. Johnson, slow down." "I can't. They're getting away. I can't let them get away." The other soldier raced onwards, careering down the hillside without care or caution. He threw his rifle to one side and began tearing off his uniform. "Sweet Jesus, Nicholas, what are you doing?" Hawthorne stopped his descent by grabbing hold of a tree trunk before his own legs ran away with him. "They're calling for me. Can't you hear them, Thorny? They're calling for me." Hawthorne carefully made his way down the remainder of the slope to the water's edge, where Johnson was removing the last of his uniform. Johnson, put your clothes back on. You'll get us both up on a charge if Volmer catches you." Nicholas Johnson was hardly listening. He could see his 3 brothers standing on the opposite shoreline, all smiling and beckoning him across. "It's my brothers. They're over there." Hawthorne peered across the expanse of water. "I can't see anything." "They're right there. Aidan, Sean and Andy. They're still alive. We got telegrams saying they were missing, presumed dead. But the army was wrong." Nicholas waved back to his brothers. I'm coming." He was about to jump in when Hawthorne dragged him back from the water's edge. "For the love of God, will you snap out of it?" Hawthorne slapped Johnson across the face twice. "There is nobody there." He pointed across the water as the moon reappeared from behind a bank of dark cloud. Nicholas was dismayed to see Hawthorne was right. "They'll be hiding behind the bushes or something, larking about as usual. I'll soon find them." "Johnson, Hawthorne, what the hell are you two doing?" Volmer strode down the hillside with a face like thunder, still pulling on his uniform. He stopped a few feet away and looked at the discarded clothes. "Well?" Johnson looked down at himself and was horrified to discover he was nude. What the hell had he been doing? He turned to Eric for reassurance. Hawthorne was rubbing the back of his neck, a sheepish look on his face. "Well, Sergeant, we were standing guard as you ordered, and young Johnson here thought he observed an intruder. The individual took flight, and we gave pursuit, chasing them down here." Volmer folded his arms and arched an eyebrow. "That still doesn't explain why Johnson is stark bollock naked while his rifle is halfway back up the hill." "Very true, that's very true. Well, It was my brothers," Nicholas interjected. "Your brothers?" "Yes, Sergeant. I saw them on the other side of the water, and I was going to swim across to join them." "Johnson, I happen to know your brothers all died in the Crimea." "Yes, Sergeant." "So how could they turn up here in Scotland?" "I don't know, Sergeant." Volmer sighed heavily. "Now, I don't know what you two have been getting up to, but mark my words, one more step out of line and I'll have you cleaning latrines for the next 5 years. Is that clear?" "Yes, Sergeant," Johnson and Hawthorne mumbled in unison. "Is that clear?" Volmer bellowed. "Yes, Sergeant," the privates shouted back, snapping to attention. "That's better. Hawthorne, you can remain on sentry duty for the rest of the night. Johnson, you can get some rest. You obviously need it more than the rest of us. But may I suggest you put your clothes back on before returning to camp? We don't want tongues wagging now, do we?" "No, Sergeant." Nicholas blushed with embarrassment and began picking up his discarded uniform as Volmer marched away, cursing quietly. Hawthorne helped him find all the bits and pieces thrown aside in the rush to catch up with his brothers. Even now, in the glint of the moonlight, Johnson thought he could see something moving under the water. No, it was probably just a reflection. Something shining dully beneath the surface. Extract from Observations and Analysis, a journal. No sooner had James's mood changed than I noticed a sudden surge in his life signs. "Doctor, you should hurry." James's blood pressure just surged upwards and his pulse almost doubled at the same time. Plus, I'm reading some unusual energy fluctuations. The doctor nodded. "James, listen to me. I need you to be calm. You're perfectly safe. Nothing can happen to you." "No, something's wrong." The energy levels doubled, then trebled within seconds. "Doctor, you've got to get him out from the hypnosis now." "James, I want you to come back to the present, the doctor said, his voice soothing and quietly insistent. Retrace your steps over the bridge. No! Stay back from me! The young man shouted, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Let me go! The doctor reached forward towards James. You must listen to me. But James slapped the doctor away, his eyes wild with rage and fear. Get away from me! I won't let you take me! One by one the monitors began to overload, showering the room with sparks and broken glass as display units shattered. I threw myself backwards to escape the explosions, still watching the cause of all this. James stood up, but at the same time his body remained seated, twitching and convulsing, blood gushing from both nostrils. The standing figure was translucent, a figure comprised of glowing energy. It reached towards the doctor, fingers curling into talon-like grasp. No! I screamed. Leave him alone. The apparition turned its attention towards me. Mary was sharing a joke with Michael at the end of the corridor when Sir Henry Ponsonby strode into view. Haven't either of you duties you should be performing? He demanded. Mary stepped away from the page, mortified at being caught in such a compromising position. We were just... I am quite aware of what you were just doing. Be thankful I came round that corridor and not Her Majesty. Mary curtsied deeply and backed away towards Nissa's bedchamber. If you'll excuse me, Sir Henry. He dismissed her with a gesture, shifting his attention to the red-faced Michael. I am looking for a guest of Her Majesty, a man called the Doctor. Have you seen him? Michael's eyes flashed past Sir Henry's face to the retreating Mary. She desperately signalled for him to deny all knowledge. I'm sorry, Sir Henry, but... Sorry? You will be when I've finished with you. Now, go to my office and stay there. I will deal with you presently. Mary had reached the door and rapped on it 3 times. Lady Nissa, Doctor, it's Mary. You should... Her words were cut short by a ghastly scream from inside the bedchamber. Mary stumbled back from the door as the wood bulged outwards at her, the features of a face straining to escape the grain. Extract from Observations and Analysis, a journal. The figure of light moved towards me, sliding through the equipment between us. As it got closer, a stench of burning sugar assaulted my senses. I scrabbled backwards, but a wall behind me prevented any escape. The apparition reached forwards, about to touch my face. Nissa, think of your father, the doctor shouted. Think of Tremas. I can't, I cried, unable to tear my gaze away from the creature looming over me. Close your eyes, Nissa. Picture his face in front of you. Fighting every instinct in my being, I forced my eyes shut and tried to conjure up images of my father. I opened my eyes again and saw him reaching towards me, his eyes kindly and warm. Come to me, my child. The voice was full of affection and love, a voice I had thought I would never hear again. My father, Tremas, stood before me, his gentle hands held out, waiting for me to embrace him. Doctor? You're safe now, Nissa. That spirit won't harm you, he replied. The creature of glowing light had been replaced by a being of flesh and blood, as solid as any mortal. I got up and threw myself into my father's arms, hugging him with all my strength. I had missed him so much, more than I realized. Never let me go again, I begged him. Lady Nissa has been having bad dreams, Sir Henry, Mary said, her back pressed against the bedchamber door. She asked me to make sure she wasn't disturbed, in the hope she would get a good night's sleep. Ponsonby scoffed at this. Stand aside. I wish to see the truth for myself. Mary refused to budge. I'm sorry, sir, but it wouldn't be right to allow a married man into Lady Nissa's bedchamber at this time of night. I am the Queen's private secretary, and you will do as I command. Stand aside. Mary finally acceded to his demand. Once she was out of the way, Ponsonby rapped on the door with his knuckles. Lady Nissa, this is Sir Henry Ponsonby. May I come in? He called. When no reply came, he knocked more firmly on the door. Lady Nissa, can you hear me? Is everything all right in there? Ponsonby tried the handle, but the door seemed to be locked from the inside. He stooped to peer through the keyhole. Sir Henry! Mary exclaimed in shock. Lady Nissa may be undressed. He glared at her. Go and fetch that page. I may require his assistance to break down this door. Mary scampered away, trying to recall the quickest way to Sir Henry's office. She had done her best. Whatever happened now, she could not be blamed. Behind her, the private secretary resumed banging on the door. Lady Nissa, can you hear me? Another scream burst from the room, but this time it was the strangled cry of a man's voice. Sir Henry redoubled his efforts to open the door. Extract from Observations and Analysis, a journal. James cried out in agony, his figure twitching and convulsing. My father and I watched as the doctor examined the young man. He is dying, heartbeat highly irregular, hardly breathing at all. I think the strain is becoming too much for him. The doctor stood up and looked at my father. Tremas, I'm sorry, but... I understand, doctor, my father replied. From outside the bedchamber, I could hear someone shouting and the door being thumped repeatedly. Understand what? I asked. What's going on? My father placed his hands on my shoulders. Nissa, I must go now. I can't stay here any longer. Please don't go. I can't stand to lose you again, I pleaded. You know I can't stay, my child. If I remain here, James will die. You don't want him to die for me, do you? No, of course not, but why does... James is sacrificing his life force to sustain your father's presence here, Nissa, the doctor said quietly. Tremas is right. You have to let him go now. Please, I can't. You don't know what you're asking, I begged. Yes, I do. Every time one of my friends dies, I have to let them go, just like I did with Adric. Every time one of my travelling companions leaves the TARDIS, I have to let them go, just as I did with Tegan. One day, you will leave me too, Nissa, and when that day comes, I will let you go. Now you must do the same with your father. No, no, I sobbed. Please, Nissa, Tremas said, but the words were coming from James's mouth. I looked down into the young man's eyes, saw the deathly pallor of his skin, and knew he was right. I stepped back from my father, out of his reach. Goodbye, father, I whispered. Goodbye, Nissa, he replied, already fading back into a creature of translucent light, burning candles behind him becoming visible through his shape. Don't cry, my child. We shall meet again on the other side. Then the light shrank into a ball of glowing energy, hovering a few feet above the ground before merging back into James's body. The young man convulsed once more, his face contorted in agony, and then he lay still, no sound audible, but shouting from outside the bedchamber. Is he still alive? The doctor bent over James's body and listened for a heartbeat. Yes, just. Lady Nissa, can you hear me? It's Sir Henry Ponsonby. Just a moment, Sir Henry, I called back before whispering to the doctor. What should I do? Just don't let him in here. We could never explain this in a way he'd understand. Mary was running down the corridor towards Nissa's bedchamber, accompanied by Michael. Sir Henry, wait! There you are at last, Ponsonby replied. Young man, I will forget your earlier transgression if you can break down this door. I'll do my best, sir, Michael replied, if you'll move aside. Just as Michael was about to charge down the door, it opened a fraction to reveal the sleepy face of Nissa. What is all the noise out here? I thought I heard people shouting, she said, stifling a yawn. One hand clutched a bedsheet around her chest, her naked shoulders visible above the crisp white fabric. Lady Nissa, are you of sound mind and body? Ponsonby asked. Yes, of course. Did I call out in my sleep again? I'm sorry if I disturbed anyone, she replied innocently.
We heard screams coming from your bedchamber. One sounded like a man. Really? Well, I can assure you, there are no men in my bedchamber. You can come in if you like, Nis offered, beginning to hold open the door, but I am not dressed. The top of her bedsheet slipped slightly downwards for a moment, allowing Sir Henry a glimpse of more naked flesh, halting his eager advance towards the doorway. Blushing crimson, he hurriedly averted his gaze. Please, Lady Nissa, have a care. She smiled sweetly. I can be dressed in a few minutes if you would allow Mary to assist me. Otherwise it may take a little longer. That'll not be necessary, the private secretary replied. I shall bid you a good night's rest. Do not hesitate to call for help if you should require it. Nissa nodded. Good night, Sir Henry. She watched him stride away. Mary almost fainted. Such was her relief at averting disaster. Lady Nissa, you shouldn't go playing with fire like that. Sir Henry is not a man to be trifled with. Thank you for the warning, Mary, she replied. If you'll excuse me, I have some tidying up to do in here. I'll see you in the morning. Nissa closed the door quietly and locked it again from the inside. Mary turned to find Michael still beside her, his mouth agape at what he had just witnessed. And as for you, quit your gawping and get back to work. Extract from Observations and Analysis, a journal. By the time I had sent Sir Henry away, the doctor had shifted James onto my bed and was giving him a more thorough examination. I slipped my arms back into the sleeves of my dress and pulled the fabric back up over my shoulders, refastening the buttons up to my neck. Decency restored, I joined the doctor at my bedside. How is he? His breathing is shallow and his pulse sluggish, but I think he will recover. It's fortunate James is still young. The strain of maintaining that manifestation would have killed anyone older. The doctor peered at me in the dim candlelight. How about you? No ill effects? Nothing physical, I said. Tricking Sir Henry had been a welcome diversion, but the crushing reality of losing my father again quickly began to weigh heavily on me. Doctor, my father, was that real? Did it feel real to you? Yes, but my heart tells me I was hugging my father, but my head tells me that cannot be. My father is dead, yet he was alive again in this room. How is that possible? The universe is a strange and wonderful place, Nissa. Even I don't understand or know everything about it, and I have been alive for hundreds of years. If I could live for a millennia of millennia, I still doubt I would have seen or known all there is to know. I don't care about all of that, I admitted. I need to know whether that was my father. Yes, it was, as far as all our perceptions could see. The doctor looked regretfully at the shattered equipment strewn about the floor of the bedchamber. Alas, all the monitors had already been overloaded before Tremas appeared, so our own perceptions are all we have to go on for now. He fingered the celery on his coat's lapel. Victoria is expecting my report on James's abilities by noon. That gives us less than 12 hours to extract what data we can from these instruments and deduce what just happened. I have my suspicions, but I would like to have evidence. Once we had tidied the room, the doctor set to work examining his shattered instruments while I wrote this account into my journal. A good observer should always note what they have seen while the experience is still fresh in their mind. At least, that's what my father used to tell me. It seems strange, but I feel closer to him now than I ever did when he was alive. Perhaps I will appreciate him more. Whatever the case, I will give the doctor until dawn to finish his investigations. Then I have a few questions he must answer.